Hello, thank you so much for joining us and welcome to Tips for the Transition, the Career Roadmap podcast. I'm so happy that you are here with us today to listen to our weekly chat. I'm Maria Tomás-Keegan, your host, and as a career and life coach for women, my vision is to create resources that help women navigate career and life challenges with more ease and grace, and to know they are not alone. So each weekly inspiring conversation is intended to help women around the world feel more confident, resilient, and brave in their careers and in their lives. So, if something strikes a chord as you listen to this conversation and you want more information, check out the show notes below for ways to connect with my guest and me. So, I often start my podcast with a question for you, and this one I think is a really good one. How much do you attach who you are to what you do for a living? Now, I know that when I was laid off from my last corporate gig, I didn't know who I was for a while because I was no longer this corporate leader of a team. And sometimes I think we need to reinvent ourselves. So I meet lots of women who ask a question like, who am I now that things have changed? And I remember asking myself that question as well. So I invited my guest to share her story with us. Avery Thatcher is CEO and founder of the Inner Stillness, Outer Chaos podcast. I love that name. And the Flow State membership. When she started her career as a registered nurse working in ICU, she noticed that many of her patients found themselves there because of illnesses or diseases that could be linked to chronic stress. So she decided to get out of the reactive side of medicine and start helping highly sensitive, high achievers prevent burnout and reverse the negative health effects of stress. And after experiencing a significant health challenge of her own, Avery had to learn to redefine her identity and grieve the loss of who she used to be. Now she shares her story openly. She's going to tell it to us here today. And she helps others realize that they're not alone in their struggles. And she talks about the strategies that helped her heal along the way. So I thought hearing this story might help some of you. So hello, Avery. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, Maria. I am so grateful to be here.
I'm so glad you are, because I think this is a topic that many of us experience and maybe are challenged by and don't know really what to do. So let's dig in. I'd love for you to maybe fill in a bit more of your background for us. Tell us about your career journey and why you chose to work in the field you did.
Absolutely. So I started off my career as a registered nurse, as you mentioned in the intro. And it was really quick that I noticed that the majority of the reasons why adults were in the hospital were because of preventable illnesses. And so I knew that I wanted to make a difference and prevent people from being in the ICU in the first place, because that is such a vulnerable and scary place for both the person and their family, that if I could help people avoid that experience altogether, it sounded worth it to me. So in 2015, I started diving into the wonderful world of research around stress and the impacts of it on our health, our mental health, our emotional body as well, and started learning all these different strategies that we probably have heard about: the meditation, the mindfulness, yoga, journaling, all of these pieces. And so I was practicing all of those, I was teaching all of those, and I was feeling great. And then in 2018, Christmas morning, I was coming off the night shift, and my charge nurse looked me in the eye and she was like, "Oh, you do not look well. Go home, feel better. I'll mark you down for sick tonight. Just take your time." And I was like, great. So I went home and I slept for 20 hours. And then I slept for 20 hours the next day, and 20 hours the day after that. And really, that moment changed everything for me. And 18 months later, I was given a diagnosis, and now I'm the proud owner of a chronic illness and a physically limited disability. And I really struggled, especially when the pandemic hit, because in SARS and H1N1 and other big health crises, I was a nurse in the ICU. I knew what life looked like in those times because I knew who I was. But because of this illness and how much it shifted, I realized that I could never be that person again. That trying to find the compromise wasn't working. And so I actually wasn't born Avery. I was born Heather, and I lived 37 years of my life as Heather. And then it was after that diagnosis and that realization that instead of fighting this new experience of my life, and instead of holding on to that identity as a registered nurse working in an ICU, I needed a fresh start. And so for me, that came as a form of a name change. And when I made that decision to change my name, a lot of the anxiety around not knowing who I was, a lot of the frustration around my body and my health and what I was capable of being so different, all of those things dissolved because I gave myself that fresh start.
Wow, that's quite a story. That's quite a story. I would love to. You've packed that with so much. I'd like to just kind of unpack it a little bit.
Absolutely.
Let's start with what brought you to. It sounds like what you described that Christmas morning, and then several days of sleeping for 20 hours. That sounds like classic burnout to me. Would you say that was what you experienced?
Absolutely. And the frustrating part is I thought I was doing everything right.
Yeah.
And
So, and it sounded to me, the meditation, the yoga, all of those things. So, that's what we teach people to do when they're stressed, right? What were the struggles you encountered in your profession that led to that?
so working as an ICU nurse, there's a lot of pressure. You
Yeah.
have people that are in their most vulnerable states. And at the time I was working in a pediatric ICU, so I was working with very sick children. And I think the stress level on the family, having worked in both locations for adults and children, the stress level on the family is so much higher when it's the child that's ill. So I think helping people navigate all of that was a joy for me in a way, but it definitely weighed on me. And
Yeah.
then unfortunately, that ICU that I was working in at the time had a very toxic environment. It was
Yeah.
very unsupportive. Groups were kind of pit against each other rather than working as a team, as you very much need in that scenario. So I think those things definitely contributed to it. And this is one of the things that I think stress management and research around this space is really missing, is we're focusing on symptom management, not addressing the cause. So what
Right.
I like to really illustrate this with is this sort of example of you sitting in a boat and you're sinking. So you've got this bucket, and that's what your yoga, your meditation, your journaling, your mindfulness practices, they're at the bucket. They're helping you bail out the water out of this boat. But your lifestyle, the societal pressures, your job, the other conditions in your life, the health concerns that you have, those are all big holes in that boat. So even though the meditation, the mindfulness, the yoga, they're helping you sink slower because you're bailing yourself out with them, you're still sinking. And so a lot of the research that I'm trying to get into and lead around burnout recovery has to look at the bigger picture, because you can't just keep putting band-aids on a gaping wound. You actually have to deal with some of those causes.
Right. Yeah. The Band-Aids don't plug the hole for very long,
No, they do
and you just
not.
keep sinking. That's such a great um, analogy for us. And, for certainly, I have a very soft spot in my heart for nurses. My mom was a nurse, and my best friend for 40 years is a nurse. So I thank you for all that you did when you were in ICU. Um, but it's not just nurses who struggle with these kinds of um, toxic environments. It happens in corporate as well. It happens in families, and our lives we can be surrounded by this toxicity, and those are holes in your boat. So, this is you went through a huge transition. You changed your name in order to facilitate, I think, this letting go of your old identity that you attached to being an ICU nurse and then becoming Avery, um, so that you could begin anew. So that's a
Mhm.
huge transition. And
Absolutely. And it involved a lot of grief.
it
And
does.
it
It does.
surprised me how much grief was involved. And looking back at the experience, I can see the different stages of grief moving through, even those have been debunked, but they still really resonated for me. And it was interesting because I skipped over anger, because I think as women, we're taught to push that anger down, to kind of ignore it, to not experience that. And so I didn't allow myself to experience that anger until I was writing on the treadmill. So on the treadmill, I have this little desk and I was typing away in my little journal, and I started talking about this side of me. And I was so angry of how much this illness had taken from me. And all of a sudden I was typing and it was just mad, like so loud and just so angry. And then all of a sudden a switch flipped. And I realized that this part of me doesn't deserve anger, it deserves compassion.
Mm.
And so I held on to this part, this transition, this phase that I was not really prepared for or didn't want. And I said, "You're welcome here. We'll make space for this." And then I was ugly crying and I couldn't stand up and I had to get off the treadmill and just let it all out. And it was really about 2 years worth of unprocessed grief that released. And that was such a profound experience for me. And I don't think that I would have been able to move through that transition as successfully as I have if I hadn't done that exercise.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up, because I think we don't allow ourselves to grieve the loss of something uh, enough to help us prepare for what's next. So there's all of these emotions. They're there. The stages of grief. I don't believe they go in that order. I believe, at least mine never did. Right.
Mhm.
I jumped around different stages. You just said that you skipped anger at first. Um, and then, they ebb and flow, and some of them come back. So whatever you experience, it's very personal, but allow yourself to grieve the loss of some, just like we allow ourselves to grieve the loss of a very dear family member or friend who has passed away. When our life changes so significantly, we need to grieve who we were so that we can welcome who we can become. And I think that's a piece of it a lot of people kind of miss out on, because they don't allow themselves to feel all of that and acknowledge it, right? And accept it.
I agree. And I think that's one of the ways that our society is really perpetuating this burnout culture, because our worth is really tied to what we can accomplish. And slowing down to take time to process and grieve does not fit into that picture, because it's not
Right.
something that produces something for someone else. So it's, again, capitalism and that kind of mindset. I have no problems with capitalism, but we have to be able to manage that capitalist hole in our boat, so that way we know how to work with it rather than have it really just keep sinking our boat.
Yeah, the expectations of others very often, especially in a corporate environment or in even a healthcare environment, maybe especially as we've experienced these, and we're still experiencing it, right? With now flu season, and COVID still is hanging around, and the respiratory ailment that has hit mostly children. It's like a triple whammy, and it's still affecting people in their lives. It's another hole in the boat. It's a big one. And if we
Absolutely.
don't take care of ourselves, and if we don't allow ourselves to feel and grieve and then prepare for what's next so that we are strong, right? Stronger. So
Yes.
I would love to hear about what in this story made the biggest difference for you in accepting this massive change in your life.
So I think the biggest thing was really the mindset shift, that I needed that fresh start. That trying to hold on to pieces of those identity that I had before were not going to help. And so I needed to cut ties and really dig into who I am, not what I do, but who I am. And I see this a lot with my clients as well. There's this one group that generally come to me, and they are parents of older children that are aging and moving out of their house. And now they're like, well, who am I now that I don't have dependent children? And it's really, we are so tied into what we do and what that means for our worth, that we have to really just step back. And it's a lot of the conversation that's happening around that affirmation, I am enough, and that you are enough just for waking up in the morning. It's easy to say that, but harder to actually believe it, especially on the emotional level. Because logically, you can tell yourself that, but your brain and its mental filters will just dismiss that if you don't believe it. So I think the biggest piece for me was really digging into that self-awareness to understand who I am despite what I'm capable of doing.
That's interesting. Who you are despite the role you've played as a nurse, right? I think part of this, as I work with women in transition, career or life transitions, it it has to do with not only understanding who you are, and it's not attached to what you do for a living or in your life, but who you are, and then who you want to become. So I'd love to talk to you about that, because you changed your name and became Avery. Yeah, we're gonna share with our audience in a little bit. Your website is called Becoming Avery, and that's who you were becoming. So talk to us about that process for you, that transition for you. What was it for you? What was that experience becoming someone else?
The biggest piece was being able to write my own story and my own beliefs. Growing up, all of us are taught how to be, what's acceptable in our family home, what's not, what challenges people, what doesn't. And myself being a very emotional, highly sensitive person, growing up in a world that was scared to feel, and in a very analytical family, it was a challenge because I didn't have someone else to model after that was as emotionally experiential and expressive as I was. And so I taught myself over time that my emotions were wrong, that they made other people uncomfortable, that crying was not acceptable. And I really just bottled all of that up as much as possible. And it wasn't until I made it into nursing school that I realized that this was actually my greatest strength. And I remember a moment where we were doing a lab where we were just practicing with each other, and it was being recorded, and then we got to watch it back. And the instructor kept saying, "Oh, look at how much empathy she's showing. Look at how connected she is to that person. Look at how when they shared that difficult experience, you could see how it affected her on her face. This is excellent emotional communication." And it knocked me on my back. I was just like, this is good. All of these things that I've been hiding are good. And that started this exploration into what was I taught versus what do I actually believe? And really, we just have to embrace our inner curious scientist to look at everything that we grew up in, everything that we were taught, and just really examine those things to see, does that actually align with who I am? And so I think those things over time really just helped shape me into the person that I was. And then this final tipping point where so much of what I saw my life being was really taken from me overnight. It just really brought me back to that core essence of who I was and what I wanted to strengthen and nurture over time.
You know, I love how you explained the journey you went on, because as I listened to you, it made me so so centered on the as you were raised, and all the, the crying and the emotional stuff was not acceptable, yet that's what you were feeling, and you had to, as you say, bottle it up. And then you went into nursing, which allowed you to express that in a very acceptable way, in fact encouraged to do so, right? That became you, right? That allowed you to be who you are. So I can only imagine how difficult it must have been for you when all of that was taken away as a result of you struggling with that health challenge and the diagnosis that required you to rethink what you do for a living. And I'd love to hear about, so how did you figure out, how could you still be that empathetic, compassionate person away from nursing and be acceptable?
So it actually allowed me to open up and explore that even further.
Good. Okay.
Earlier on in that journey, I felt like I sort of went into ICU nurse mode. When there's an emergency happening, you're just like shut down, logic only. And so in the early phases of the illness and all of the testing and all of the potential diagnoses getting thrown out that were all very scary, it really just became into information gathering mode. And I realized that in that space, I was like, I don't feel like me anymore. And so then I started to do some of the work that I teach as well, just to really dig into that and allow the emotions to come forward again. And although it was a little bit scary in the beginning, it just came down to communication. So my partner, he and I have been married for a couple of years before I got sick. It was only about 3 months before I got sick, but we've been married for a couple of years now. And in this journey of me kind of figuring out more of who I was separate from the career, I realized that I'm going to cry sometimes just because I need to let emotions out. And it was challenging for him initially because he wanted to fix it. And so I had to have that conversation with him to be like, these are just processing tears. Like, there's nothing that needs to be fixed. You don't have to say anything. You didn't do anything. And so we actually came up with a code word, like a safe word for emotional expression. So I just tell him that I'm having onderdonk tears. And he just knows that, oh yeah, okay, I just need to let her cry. I can ask, like, do you need a hug? But other than that, it's good. So really, it comes down to a lot of really good communication, I think, both the people that you're around and with yourself. Journaling has always been an important part of things for me, but especially after my transition out of hospital nursing and into more of this proactive care, journaling and documenting my thought process along the way has been invaluable.
I love that you said that, because it is a really powerful way to release our feelings, or what we're thinking about, what we are experiencing internally, so that we can acknowledge them, become aware that they exist, and allow them to come up and out, so that we can, look at them a little bit differently, right? When we are able to see them for what they really are, then they're not quite so scary. We can apply our logic. We can look at it in a more rational, kind of as an objective observer. So I love that you said that. Journaling is such a good, powerful exercise when you're struggling with stuff, tough stuff.
Mm-hmm. And not everybody is open to paper journaling or digital journaling. Some people really do best when they verbally journal.
Yeah.
And it's verbal processing can be really powerful for some people. So if the idea of writing things down, you're hearing that and you're like, I don't know if I can do that.
Yeah.
Put voice notes on your phone, talk to a friend, talk to your dog, talk to your houseplant. It doesn't matter. We just need to get some of those thoughts out. And so whatever way that works for you, go for it.
Yeah. You're so right about that. There's more than one way to journal, right? So I have a very dear friend who's going through some really tough stuff, and she needs to talk it through. So she'll just text me, can you chat? And if I can, we get on the phone for 10 or 15 minutes, and she gets to just talk it through. I barely say a word. She just talks it out, and she processes what she's thinking and feeling in that way. And that's a great way to do it. If you have someone that you can talk with, that you trust, and who will be there, just be there and listen. Sometimes you don't even have to say a word.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah. Talking to my dog helps me a lot.
They're such great listeners.
Yeah. I have conversations with my dog and my 2 cats all the time. Call me crazy.
Only if they start talking back.
Yeah. Well, actually, they do have their way of expressing themselves. Yeah.
So true.
I don't always understand them, though.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So, Avery, is there maybe one strategy that you can share without giving away your tips for the end? Is there maybe a strategy that worked really well for you that you could share with someone maybe who is going through a similar transition in their life, either a health transition or a career transition, a life transition?
Absolutely.
What worked for you?
I think there's 2 things really. The first is what I call what if affirmations. So affirmations are, like I mentioned before, the I am enough, I am confident, I can figure this out. Those are really hard for us to believe, especially when we're still in the thick of it, when we're in the weeds and we're like, I don't know if I can figure this out. So instead of just repeating those I am affirmations, use just 2 magical words at the front of that sentence to create a conversation. So instead of saying I can find another opportunity, say, what if I find another opportunity? What if I am enough? What if I am successful at this job interview? And by putting that what if in front of it, you really allow yourself to bypass that part of your brain that would just dismiss the affirmation. And you now create that conversation. You create the possibility. So what if affirmations are one of my suggestions of things that really worked well for me. And then the next one is a self-compassion script. So self-compassion is trained out of us at a very early age. We're really taught to put other people first before us. And this is why self-care is so challenging for so many of us, because it really does feel selfish. It feels wrong. We've been taught that you're supposed to put everybody else first, but we've really gotten to the point that we wouldn't hold the door open for ourselves. We wouldn't give up the seat on the bus for ourselves. So we really have to work on logically bringing that practice back in. So self-compassion scripts have 3 pieces. The first is you validate how you're feeling. And that is such an important piece that we don't often do for ourselves. We often blow past the emotion without actually validating that experience. Then we need to offer some comfort, just to remind ourselves of what we are capable of doing. And then we give ourselves a plan. And so a clear example of this was when I was initially, right after I got sick and was home after leaving work, it was discovered that I had a really huge mass on my thyroid. It was about 2.5 inches, almost 5 centimeters. And I was getting it biopsied to see if it was cancer. And they put a very big needle into your neck and just poke it around and grab cells and things. And it's not comfortable, I'm not going to lie. And so while it was happening, I was using this self-compassion script. And I was saying, yeah, you know what? It hurts. And yes, it's scary. You don't know what this is going to mean. It's okay to be scared. But you have support. You have knowledge. You've got healthcare around you. You're going to be able to figure this out. So for right now, just take a deep breath and you can make it through this moment. Take another deep breath. You can make it through the next moment. And I just repeated that to myself over and over until the biopsy was done. And it really allowed me to stay calm, to feel in control, and to help myself through that experience. So the self-compassion script can be a really helpful strategy for people. So again, you want to validate how you're feeling. You want to offer some comfort, and then you want to give yourself a plan. And that could be as simple as take a deep breath, make it through this next moment. Take another deep breath, make it through the next moment. It doesn't have to be a really big plan.
I love those. Those are so simple, not always easy to remember to do at the time, right? Mm-hmm. But those are powerful opportunities for people to just, like you say, take control of the moment you're in, be present in it. I love the what if questions. Those are they kind of flip the script a bit on the, I can do this, right? I'm strong, I'm resilient, I can do this. The other thing that I would suggest along with the what if is when you're in a situation, it is likely that it's not the first time you've been challenged by something. And just remember back when you were challenged by something and how well you made it through, what you did to make it through. So what if this was like the last time, and the last time turned out just fine? I went through some tough stuff, but I got through it, and I can get through this again too. What if it was like that? So that's maybe a way to combine those ideas to help you through it. Mm-hmm. Transitions are so tough.
Yes, they are.
What I wrote, the title of my book is From Upside Down to Right Side Up, because these kinds of significant events in our lives can turn us upside down. And figuring out how to turn ourselves right side up again is it's a journey and it's a challenge. And there are a lot of us who have been through tough stuff in our lives and we've figured it out. And that's not to say that we won't stumble again, but there are what I call tools in your treasure chest now, Avery, because of your experience and the way you can now help others, and because of my experiences and how I can help others, because we've been there and they don't have to do it alone. That there are people who understand this transition stuff, so that it will make it just a little bit easier, I think, to talk to somebody who's been there.
I agree. I think we don't understand the value of having someone or a couple of people in our corner when we need them. I'm a fiercely independent person. And so early on in my diagnosis and figuring things out, my partner wasn't even able to come to the appointments to start with. He knew when they were, but that was all. I got myself there. That was fine. And then he was able to drive me, but wait in the parking lot. Then he was able to come into the building. Then he was able to come into the waiting room. And then finally, I tried having him in the doctor's office with me. And that day, when he was in there, the light went off in my brain and I was like, why haven't I been doing this all along? It was so much better. And I think it's just, we're so used to being independent that it's hard to know where somebody else fits in there sometimes. But absolutely, having that support is really helpful.
It just takes so much of the burden off us when we share our experience with someone. It lightens our load, and it's so beneficial to have someone who is not as emotionally attached to the issue that we're going through, whatever that is, to be the observer, to listen, to maybe catch things that we miss in the conversation with, in this case, your case, the doctor. But having an advocate is, some people think it's weak to rely on others. I think it's a sign of strength because you recognize that there's a benefit to that. And that's I just think it's so important to recognize the power of having people around you. I call them my personal board of directors.
Oh, I love that.
People around me. Well, if we are the CEO of our lives, right? If we are, then every CEO has a powerful board of directors to support them. So why shouldn't we? Why shouldn't we choose people who can support us in various ways? And that board of directors is dynamic. So as our needs change, so does our board of directors. So it's really important to acknowledge the fact that we're not put on this earth to be lone wolves. That's not how we are. That's not how we're made. So it's a lesson that I think those of us who are fiercely independent, as you say, could learn about the benefit of having that kind of support. Okay, well, Avery, we end every episode with my guests sharing their best takeaways, their strategies and tips. That's why I call the show Tips for the Transition. I hope you haven't given them all away, but remind us at least, what are your best tips for us? Start with your first one.
So my tips are all going to be mindset shifts. So the first one is always do your best. Doesn't mean always be perfect. Your best is going to change moment to moment, day to day, experience to experience. So give yourself some grace to know that you're doing your best, but it doesn't have to be perfect.
Oh, I love that. That's and so important, right? We are very, very, I'm a recovering perfectionist myself. So I understand that one really, really well. Don't strive for perfection, strive for excellence is what I like to say. That's a
Yeah.
great one. I love that. All right. Tell us your second one.
So my second one is to always embrace curiosity. So when something doesn't go your way, or if you're trying to create a change and it's not working, instead of beating yourself up, look at the bigger factors that are contributing to that. Look at the other holes in your boat that are making it hard for you to do what you want to do. There is a lot more that is influencing our habits and our lives than we even realize. So instead of taking things personally, really step back and embrace that inner curiosity.
Hmm. That's a good one too. Get curious. Ask questions, right? What if is a great one to start with, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Mm. Are there any other questions, the way to start questions that help you get curious?
I think really for me, it starts with taking a couple of deep breaths. And I associate that with sinking down below the surface of a really big stormy ocean and being able to see everything from calm clarity. And that way I can see what else led to this happening. So it's
Mm.
really not necessarily questions, but slowing down and taking those deep breaths, because that's actually what gives us access to that prefrontal cortex part of our brain, that higher level thinking brain. So yeah, it's more of the breathing practice for me.
I love that. Getting calm is a really great place to start from. One of the questions I like when I get curious is, what am I missing?
Yep.
What am I missing? Is there something I'm missing? Yeah. Do I have it? Do I have all the information I need? What am I missing? Yeah, that's a good
I
one.
like that.
Okay. What's the third one?
So the third one is to realize that 1 minute of self care is better than no minutes. I would love to meet the person that said, you must have 30 minutes of self care every day, because I want to shake them and be like, why? Why did you give people that really unrealistic expectation? Because self care doesn't have to be this grand show that's planned and blocked into 30 minutes. It can be as simple as taking 5 deep breaths before going into the grocery store. So 1 minute is better than no minutes when it comes to taking care of yourself.
That's such good advice. And I think what we have to do is just be more present with ourselves so that we we take that minute, right? And we acknowledge that that minute serves as self-care, right? So
Mm-hmm.
if we just can admit that and say, okay, I deserve this minute. And your example, I'm just gonna pause before I go in and rush through the grocery store and take a minute to breathe.
Mm-hmm.
It calms you down.
It does.
And I think when you allow yourself those minutes, and 5 minutes is good too, but we don't always have that. So I love
Mm-hmm.
that you said that. Just give yourself permission to take a minute, and maybe there are multiple minutes, maybe 30 of them in a day, that you just pause before you go jump into doing something that is, put you back in the rat race,
Mm-hmm.
and breathe. I love that. That's such good advice. Avery, thank you so much for being here, for sharing your story. This idea of reinventing yourself and the enormous transition you had to go through, to become Avery, it's a powerful story, and I appreciate your being so transparent and sharing it with us today.
Well, thank you, Maria, for holding space for it and creating this environment where we can share.
Oh, it is my pleasure. It's what brings me joy, to be able to let other women know that you're not alone. Whatever you're going through, you're not alone. All right, so I know that there are going to be plenty of folks who are going to want to hear more from you and know more about you. So tell us the one best way for them to get in touch with you.
So that would be to go to my website. There's links to all kinds of free resources in there. I've got a couple of podcasts linked there as well. So that is www.becomingavery.com.
Fabulous. Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for having me.
And for those of you who are watching and listening, I want to thank you also. I appreciate that you are a part of this community. And if you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave a comment, or click a star wherever you might be watching or listening. And as I said at the top of the show, I love creating and sharing resources for women. Plus, as a career and life coach, I work with women to help them navigate challenges with more ease and grace. So if something in this episode resonates with you and you'd like a fresh perspective on it, reach out and let's have a conversation. You'll find the links you need to connect with Avery or for me below in the show notes. Plus, I invite you to continue this conversation in my private Facebook group called the Career Transition Roadmap. So again, look for the links below. And we'll meet again here next Wednesday, like every Wednesday, because you know what? I believe it's our time to thrive. So let's thrive together. I'm Maria Tomás-Keegan. Till next time, helping you turn transition into triumph.